Here is something absolutely nobody talks about when they discuss the sprawling, majestic history of Middle-earth. When Tolkien meticulously built his world, he gave the great elven lords immense power, not just metaphorical political power. We are talking about literal, physical, world-altering magical power. He gave them rings forged by the brilliant Celebrimbor, each one specifically designed to bend time, preserve breathtaking beauty, and hold back the inevitable decay of the mortal world. Elrond, the Lord of Rivendell, held Vilya, the Ring of Air. Galadriel, the Lady of the Golden Wood, held Nenya, the Ring of Water. Círdan the Shipwright briefly, but crucially, held Narya, the Ring of Fire, before passing it to Gandalf the Grey. Every single surviving great elven realm in the Third Age had one of these 3 rings of power quietly humming behind it, sustaining its borders and keeping the shadow at bay. Every single one. Except one. Thranduil, the Elven King of the Woodland Realm, never held a ring of power. He possessed absolutely no magical artifact. He received no divine, glowing gift from the Valar in the West. He wielded no legendary, glowing blade with a lineage older than memory itself. And yet, when Sauron's suffocating shadow poured out of the fortress of Dol Guldur and violently swallowed the entire southern half of his massive forest whole, Thranduil was still there. When the War of the Ring finally ended in blood and ash, and the other great elven lords finally surrendered to weariness and set sail for the undying lands in the west, Thranduil was still there. Most people who know Tolkien's work, especially through the popular adaptations, remember Thranduil simply as the Cold One, the difficult, arrogant one, the petty elf king who stubbornly locked up a company of desperate dwarves over an ancient dispute about gemstones. That reading is not technically wrong, it is just profoundly, dangerously incomplete. Because once you truly understand exactly where Thranduil came from, what horrific things he watched happen, what immense grief he carried, and what he actively, daily chose to keep carrying, the supposedly cold king completely stops being cold. He becomes something much more specific, much more earned. He becomes the only one who stayed. To truly understand Thranduil, you first have to deeply understand his father. And to understand his father, you have to sit quietly with one of the absolute most brutal, devastating moments in the entire mythology of the First Age. Oropher, Thranduil's father, was Sindarin. He came from Doriath, the great, legendary hidden kingdom of Elu-Thingol, nestled deep in the lost lands of Beleriand. Tolkien explicitly confirmed in Unfinished Tales that Oropher was among the shattered survivors of Doriath's violent fall. He was one of the noble Sindar who fled frantically eastward after absolutely everything collapsed. And the collapse of Doriath was absolute. It started with a magnificent necklace. The Noglamir forged long ago by masterful dwarven craftsmen, then brought to King Thingol after the ruin of the fortress Nargothrond. Thingol, blinded by pride, wanted to set a captured Silmaril, a jewel containing the very light of creation, into the necklace. He invited the skilled dwarves of Nogrod into his halls to do the delicate work. But when the masterpiece was finished, the jewel's unbearable, cursed beauty deeply infected both sides. A bloody, frantic quarrel broke out right there in the deep treasure vault of Menegroth itself. The dwarves brutally murdered Thingol, in his own home, over a shining gem. The surviving dwarves fled back to Nogrod, raised a massive, vengeful army, returned, and utterly sacked the hidden city. Melian, the Maya Thingol's divine wife, the immense spiritual force that had literally bent reality around Doriath to protect it for centuries, felt the sudden loss of her husband so completely, so totally, that she simply released her physical form and withdrew from Middle-earth entirely. She was one of the oldest living powers in the world, and sheer grief unmade her. Oropher was inside that horrific story. He did not read about it in a history book later. He was there. He watched his king die a pathetic death over a piece of jewelry. He watched his proud people fracture and slaughter each other over beauty. He watched the protective forest light instantly go out. And then, Beleriand itself physically sank beneath the crushing sea at the apocalyptic end of the First Age. Whatever remained of that ancient, beautiful world was gone forever. So, Oropher did exactly what deep trauma survivors very often do. He went somewhere quieter. somewhere much smaller, somewhere as far away from great, ruinous politics and legendary, cursed artifacts as he could possibly manage. He crossed the towering misty mountains, found the vast greenwood, and discovered the Sylvan Elves. These were a simple people who had never gone to Valinor, never seen the divine light of the two trees, never got entangled in the epic, suicidal ambitions of the Noldor high houses. They were simple, rooted, present. He became their king. And Thranduil was born directly into that heavy inheritance. He was the son of a traumatized survivor. He was the heir to magnificent ruins he never even saw, but would feel the crushing weight of his entire life. A noble Sindarin prince ruling a simple Sylvan people belonging fully to neither world, anchored permanently in the tense space between. That specific gap, that constant tension, that in-between space that is exactly where Thranduil actually lives, and it violently shapes everything he does. The second devastating wound came on the ash plain of Dagorlad. Late in the Second Age, Sauron moved again. The legendary last alliance of elves and men formed under High King Gil-galad and Elendil, the absolute largest military coalition Middle-earth had ever seen. Oropher brought the Sylvan warriors of the Greenwood to the desolate plain of Dagorlad to fight the Shadow. This is where Tolkien drops a critical detail in unfinished tales that most modern adaptations quietly erase. Oropher flatly refused to fight under Gil-galad's supreme command. He was Sindarin. The very idea of placing his Sylvan host under Noldor authority under a high king from a lineage that had always, in Oropher's lived, traumatic experience, been associated with catastrophe, kinslaying, and massive overreach was completely unacceptable. So, when the official signal came to advance the lines, Oropher did not wait for it. He charged early, on his own, with only his own men. He died in that desperate charge. 2/3 of his entire Sylvan army died screaming in the mud with him. Think for a moment about what that specific event means for Thranduil. He did not just lose his father at Dagorlad. He lost him to a deeply flawed decision, a stubborn refusal. A Sindarin pride that was perhaps understandable, maybe even historically justified in its origins, but absolutely catastrophic in its execution. And then, young Thranduil had to gather exactly what was left, the surviving, bleeding third of a shattered Sylvan host, and hold the brutal siege at the Black Gate for years, until Sauron finally fell. He came home with a third of the army he had left with, and entirely without the man who had built the kingdom. Every single political and military choice Thranduil makes in the Third Age runs directly through that blood-soaked field, when he stubbornly keeps the Woodland Realm sealed tight. When he keeps his cold distance from the great councils and alliances, when he flatly refuses to commit his forces to other people's wars, people eagerly read it as pure arrogance or cowardly isolationism. It isn't. It is trauma-induced pattern recognition from a king who watched a proud, early charge kill 2/3 of his entire world. Now, here is the part of the story most people simply never stop to calculate. Dol Guldur was not some abstract, distant threat on a map. It was literally in Thranduil's forest, in the southern reaches of what had been the beautiful Greenwood, the dark power Tolkien first called the Necromancer, later confirmed as Sauron himself gathering strength, set up residence, and began actively, aggressively poisoning the land outward. Giant spiders, breeding orcs, a creeping, suffocating darkness spreading steadily north through the ancient trees. And remember, Thranduil did not have a ring. He could not slow time in a protected, magical bubble the way Galadriel could in Lothlorien. He could not hold the harsh season still, keeping the leaves perfectly green while the world violently aged around him, the way Vilya allowed Elrond to magically preserve Rivendell. He had cold stone, he had deadly archers, he had his own iron will. So, he made a calculated decision that looked exactly like a cowardly retreat, but was actually brilliant defensive architecture. He moved his capital. He pulled his people out of the southern halls, away from the rapidly spreading shadow, far north into the rocky, defensible interior of the forest. He built the underground palace, the narrow stone bridge, the single, highly defensible entrance that Tolkien describes so vividly in The Hobbit. Every single detail of that description is not fantasy flavor. It is a military document. The king had accurately analyzed his threat, accepted the harsh limits of exactly what he could defend without magic, and built the absolute smallest perimeter he could actually hold. And he held it for roughly 2,000 years, without a ring. The math on this should stop people cold. Rivendell endured with Vilya, Lothlorien endured with Nenya. Both of those incredibly powerful rings were doing massive, heavy lifting, literally bending the physical and temporal laws of Middle-earth to preserve those specific places. Thranduil's Woodland Realm endured for millennia on absolutely nothing but strategic contraction and collective, unyielding stubbornness. That is not a small thing. It is one of the most quietly extraordinary military feats in the entire history of Middle-earth, hiding in plain sight in a chapter most casual readers treat as the light-hearted, fairy tale setup before the real story starts. People have argued loudly for decades about the dwarf incident in The Hobbit, the gemstone dispute, the arrest of Thorin's company. Let's be completely accurate about what actually happened in the text. Thorin's heavily armed company entered Thranduil's sovereign kingdom entirely without permission. They were found actively fighting giant spiders deep in his forest creatures that were only there precisely because of the spreading darkness from Dol Guldur, which Thranduil had been desperately managing and containing for centuries with the blood of his own people. When captured and brought before him, they stubbornly refused to explain their purpose, repeatedly. Thranduil didn't execute them. He imprisoned them safely, fed them well, and waited. Is that petty tyranny? Or is it a king with a very specific, highly tuned threat model, one shaped entirely by watching his own father die because someone rushed in blindly without waiting, without negotiating, without knowing exactly what they were walking into, behaving with significantly more caution than the situation might have initially seemed to demand? The gemstone context matters deeply too. Tolkien explicitly records in The Hobbit that Thranduil had previously contracted dwarf craftsmen to intricately work his raw gold and silver, and that the transaction ended in a deep, bitter dispute, each side firmly convinced the other had acted in bad faith. That isn't just backstory flavor. That is the specific, concrete historical reason. Thranduil's intense caution around heavily armed dwarves carrying undisclosed agendas in his forest isn't paranoia. It is precedent. Then comes the massive battle of 5 armies, and Thranduil does something the character's loudest critics tend to completely forget. He shows up. He marches his host directly to Erebor in armed support of the Lake Men, a people he had actual working relationships with, vulnerable neighbors his kingdom had peacefully coexisted with across the years. When Thorin arrogantly refuses to honor Bard's entirely legitimate claim for rebuilding Laketown, Thranduil stands firmly with Bard. And when the goblins and wargs suddenly pour down from the mountains, he switches sides absolutely without hesitation. Dwarves, men, eagles, Beorn. He lines his elves up with all of them in the exact same defensive line. There is a version of Thranduil that easily could have said, "This isn't my war. I'm going home to my caves." He didn't say that. The ancient, festering wound from the dwarf dispute, the deep wariness, the accumulated grievance, it all dropped instantly. The absolute moment, a real, existential enemy appeared. That's not a small character moment. That is the exact difference between a damaged person and a broken one. At the very end of the Third Age, while the main, famous story plays out dramatically at the gates of Mordor, Tolkien mentions almost in passing that a massive, brutal battle is being fought simultaneously in Mirkwood. Sauron's forces poured out of Dol Guldur and attacked the Woodland Realm directly. Thranduil held the line. No ring, no divine reinforcement, just his fierce forest warriors and the harsh landscape he had spent centuries learning how to perfectly defend. When Galadriel finally threw down the walls of Dol Guldur from the south, Thranduil violently drove the remaining invaders out from the north simultaneously. And then, standing quietly in the devastated forest after the shadow finally lifted, Thranduil renamed it. It had been called Greenwood the Great once. Then it became Mirkwood Dark, poisoned, lost. He renamed it Erin Lascalin, the Wood of Green Leaves. That is not just a symbolic act. That is a deeply therapeutic one. That is a weary king who has spent exactly 3,000 years carrying the burning wreckage of Doriath, the unburied dead of Dagorlad, the slow, agonizing suffocation of his own forest, and consciously choosing, in the very one moment when the crushing weight actually lifts, to mark the new chapter with a beautiful name instead of a tired sigh. And then he stayed. Elrond left. Galadriel left. Círdan, the last great elf of the western shores, eventually left. The powerful ring-bearers sailed west because the age of elves was definitively ending. Their magic was fading, and there was simply nothing left for them to preserve. Thranduil stayed in his wood. Tolkien never records him sailing. He remains quietly in Erin Lascalain with his people as the mortal Fourth Age begins. Some read this as mere stubbornness. It might be, but it might also be the absolute most honest expression of what Thranduil actually was. Not a king of a fading, glorious legacy constantly reaching backward toward Valinor, but a king of a highly specific place, a specific people, a specific forest that is finally, after thousands of brutal years, clean again. The wood needed tending. He stayed to tend it. There's a line of thinking in epic fantasy literature that goes exactly like this. The great ones carry magical relics. The great ones receive shining gifts from higher powers. The great ones are physically marked by the gods as significant. Thranduil never got the relic. He never got the gift. He never got the mark. What he got was Dagorlad. What he got was Mirkwood. What he got was 2,000 years of desperately holding a shrinking perimeter against a dark power that had corrupted half his entire world. And he held. Not because a magic ring sustained him, not because a Valar reached down from the heavens and steadied his sword arm, because he decided to, because the forest was his, because the people in it were his, because some mornings, simply deciding to stay is the absolute hardest and most necessary form of courage there is. That is the King Tolkien built quietly in the margins, the one who didn't get a song in the main text, the one whose massive victory was so quiet it barely registers in the appendices, the one who was still there,